People usually study early medieval European politics by looking at regions separately or through a view focused mainly on the Franks. Because of this, broad conclusions about the whole continent have often been shaped by only one part of it. To reach a more balanced understanding, one would need a careful comparison of many different kingdoms across Western Europe. Such a task is much larger than this video, yet it is still necessary to examine how government, authority, and political ideas developed in these 6 centuries. Here the focus will be on how power was controlled, how rulers acted, and how political thinking changed over time, while also noting patterns that people across Europe shared. The political world of the early Middle Ages cannot be understood without remembering that it grew from the slow transformation of the Roman Empire. During the first centuries covered here, old Roman systems were fading, but many influences survived. From the 8th century onward, Frankish expansion shaped most of Western Europe. Their armies pushed into lands that had never been under Roman rule and absorbed many new groups. In the later part of this era, the edges of the Carolingian kingdoms almost matched the boundaries of Latin Christianity. Yet Western Europe also included Christian realms far from Frankish control, such as Britain, Ireland, northern Spain, and Benevento in Italy. There were also border regions like Moravia and Bulgaria, where Latin and Greek Christian traditions competed for influence. In the 10th century, new changes followed. Latin Christianity spread farther into Scandinavia, Poland, and Hungary, while the rulers of Kievan Rus accepted Christianity from the Byzantine world. The large size of the Frankish Empire left a strong imprint on the political map that followed. However, Carolingian rulers did not always design their borders by choice. Often they simply kept earlier boundaries after conquering local powers. The Franks adapted to what already existed rather than building a new order from nothing. At its height, the Frankish Empire stretched from Brittany in the west to Carinthia in the east, and from the Pyrenees and northern Italy up to the shores of the North Sea and Baltic. Many diverse peoples lived within it. Understanding how the center ruled these distant areas is key to understanding power from the 8th century onward. The borders were active zones where soldiers, traders, churchmen, and ordinary travelers crossed back and forth, just as they had in Roman times. Yet frontier peoples did not look only toward the Franks. They also traded, fought, and negotiated with others around them. Expansion brought contact, but it also demanded effort to keep order and prevent conflict. Written sources often speak of peace meetings, embassies, and negotiated truces between hostile groups. Even though evidence is uneven, archaeology and texts occasionally reveal how skilled early medieval rulers could be in dealing with neighbors and gathering information, especially in the Byzantine world where records are richer. Outside Frankish authority, yet still connected to it through war, trade, or diplomacy, were Scandinavia, the British Isles, Muslim Spain, the Papacy, Byzantium, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. Because the Frankish realm was huge, and because it interacted with so many others, Frankish ideas about government became as influential as the older Roman tradition. In some areas, like Croatia or Denmark, new forms of kingship in the 9th and 10th centuries grew directly from Frankish contact and example. A late Roman document called the Notitia Dignitatum lists the many civil and military offices of the empire in the late 4th century. The empire was so large that the emperor needed many officials to rule it, and frequent delegation of authority was unavoidable. Corruption may also have been common. The empire was divided into provinces, each led by a governor who managed law, finance, and local administration. Several provinces formed a diocese, supervised by a vicarius. Dioceses were then grouped into large prefectures, each overseen by a praetorian prefect who held wide authority. These officials relied on scribes and a steady flow of written records to run the state. Military power could easily overshadow civil authority. In the late empire, generals often held enormous influence, especially when emperors themselves often came from the army. Civil and military roles could merge in one person. The rise of the general Aetius, known for campaigns against Goths, Burgundians, and Attila, shows how powerful such leaders could become. Many groups living just beyond Rome's borders supplied soldiers for Roman armies. Their leaders sometimes became high-ranking men within the empire. Stilicho, whose family was of barbarian origin, reached the highest military rank and married into the imperial family. Gundobad of the Burgundians once served Rome in the same way. Euric ruled both his Gothic followers and many Roman subjects in Aquitaine. Even Childeric, father of Clovis, seems to have held Roman provincial office in northern Gaul before Frankish rule expanded. When the central Roman government disappeared in the west, the old provincial structures did not vanish overnight. In many places, former Roman systems of administration and record-keeping continued to function. Local barbarian war leaders began to take on civil duties, often working together with Roman officials who already knew how to run provinces. Military command and civil authority were closely linked. As a result, many habits and tools of the Roman bureaucracy survived inside the early barbarian kingdoms. A Gallo-Roman noble called Sidonius Apollinaris, living in the Auvergne, describes Gothic rule in southern Gaul under kings like Theodoric and Euric. He mentions one colleague who spent his days in the royal council gathering news about events in the wider world, and another who knew German well, translated letters, and acted as a leading legal mind for the Burgundians. These examples show how Roman-style skills and offices were reused in new political settings. In the eastern half of the empire, Roman structures also continued, but they were constantly adjusted to fit new realities, especially from the 7th century onward. In other regions that had never belonged to the Roman Empire, such as Scandinavia, the Slavic lands, and Ireland, communities had their own systems of leadership in war and peace, and their own ways of keeping order and resolving disputes. These local arrangements clearly worked in their own context. However, by the time they appear in written sources, they are already shaped by Christian and classical influences that came through the Church. For example, Irish law and ideas of kingship show a strong mark of the Old Testament. This makes it hard to see clearly what pre-Christian structures looked like. In addition, many of the earliest descriptions of areas outside the Old Empire were written by observers from Romanized regions. They interpreted what they saw using their own concepts and vocabulary, writing in Latin with layers of meaning already attached. Frankish references to Slavs or Scandinavians, for instance, are therefore not a neutral record and are of limited use for reconstructing how those societies were organized before Christian influence and closer contact with the rest of Europe. Even though the Roman inheritance remained powerful, the political forms that arose in Europe during the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries should be understood in their own right. It is misleading to treat early medieval kingdoms as a chaotic, decayed version of late Roman society. or as a rough and unfinished first stage of the more familiar political systems that existed in Europe after the 11th century. They were different in structure, purpose, and self-understanding, and must be studied as such. At the same time, the shape of early barbarian kingdoms cannot be separated from the special conditions of the 5th century and the years after the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor in 476. Regions that had long been governed from the imperial center suddenly experienced the absence of central control. Local populations were mixed, long-settled inhabitants, army units and their families, and people from other parts of the empire who had settled as landowners or officials in both civil and church hierarchies. All of them now had to organize themselves without imperial direction. Exactly how new leaders and institutions appeared in the 5th and 6th centuries is often unclear. In Britain, for example, we depend mostly on later guesses, reconstructions based on conditions a century or more after Roman rule had ended, and a great deal of archaeological evidence. The neat picture of a set of fixed kingdoms in early England is largely the work of historians writing from the 8th century onward, who may have found it hard to imagine looser or more fluid arrangements. One such writer, Bede, at least shows some awareness that the situation was more complicated than a simple map of stable kingdoms suggests. Archaeology indicates that clearly defined small kingdoms only began to harden into shape around the year 600. On the European mainland, the sources are richer. There we can see local elites, the army, and barbarian allies of Rome taking over the work of government. Those who held power were usually men with wealth and reliable armed support. In some of the earliest texts from these successor states, the new rulers are described as kings of specific peoples, who now occupied former Roman provinces and ruled over a mixed population of newcomers and longer-established inhabitants. The primary sources are often unclear, and modern historians argue about the origins and identities of the many groups mentioned: Romans, Gallo-Romans, Hispano-Romans, Romano-Britons, Picts, Scots, Franks, Goths, Lombards, Burgundians, Sueves, Alemanni, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, and others. These labels do not simply describe biological descent. Many of them were shaped after the fact, as part of a process modern scholars call ethnogenesis, in which collective identities are built and defined over time. This process is especially visible in histories written from the 6th century onward, such as narratives about the Goths that tell of legendary origins and long migrations. Stories about the beginnings of royal dynasties played a central role in this. Their successes in battle, their ability to defeat rivals, and their defense of their followers strengthened loyalty and a sense of belonging. Law and the reach of a ruler's authority also helped create political identity, regardless of ethnic background. In other words, these peoples are, to a significant degree, products of texts and shared stories, not fixed tribes existing from time immemorial. We might compare these early kingdoms to a loose association of nations gradually freeing themselves from older imperial or provincial frameworks. Archaeology cannot easily define who counted as Roman or non-Roman. What it can show are changes in settlement patterns, burial customs, material culture, and the concentration of wealth. If we insist on chasing the exact proportion of old identities in each society, we risk missing what was new. It is like eating a soufflé and focusing only on the separate amounts of eggs, cheese, and flour instead of the final dish. It is more useful to ask how these different groups, once mixed together, arranged their social and political life. Their ways of governing combined what they inherited with new solutions tailored to local needs. In many cases, barbarian kingdoms roughly followed the outlines of former Roman provinces. The old civitas units, which were city territories with surrounding countryside, were taken over by the church and became the basis for dioceses under bishops. In Roman times, the reach of central administration defined the borders of the empire, as described in documents like the Notitia Dignitatum. In the early Middle Ages, it was now the reach of a king's power that defined his kingdom. It is significant that rulers were usually, though not always, named as kings of a people rather than kings of a land. Clear territorial thinking developed slowly. Over time, political communities began to be described more precisely in geographical terms. A famous example is the division of the Frankish Empire at the Treaty of Verdun in 843, when the surviving sons of Louis the Pious divided their father's realm. One son received the lands to the east of the Rhine, including some districts on the western bank. Another took a long strip between the Rhine and the Scheldt, and down through regions along the Meuse and the Rhone to the Mediterranean, with certain extra areas attached. The third son was given the rest of the western territories down to Spain. This settlement created a central Middle Kingdom, later called Lotharingia, which became an area of constant dispute and was not definitively settled until many centuries later. Below the level of the king's realm were smaller units such as dioceses, counties, or, in the Frankish case, pagi. These were managed by officials acting on behalf of the ruler. Over time, new units were invented, such as ealdordoms, shires, and hundreds in England, or themes in the Byzantine Empire. The military role of these subdivisions varied, but a count or similar official usually had several tasks: overseeing courts and justice, supervising mints, maintaining roads and bridges, and calling up troops for campaigns when ordered. Sometimes counts were outsiders sent into a region. In other cases, they were drawn from powerful local families. As we move toward the 10th century, countships and similar offices increasingly became hereditary and linked closely to the family's land. In border regions, especially in frontier zones of the Frankish realm, marcher counts carried even greater responsibility for defense and for handling relations with neighboring powers beyond the king's direct control. At the top of all these arrangements stood the king. He was commander of the army and carried the main responsibility for keeping peace and upholding justice. Like Roman emperors before him, he issued laws, often after discussion with leading men and advisors. From the beginning, his relationship with the church was also central. His authority was seen as coming from God, and he was thought to be answerable for both the earthly welfare and the spiritual safety of his people. When the Visigothic king, Record in Spain, led his kingdom from Arian to Catholic Christianity in 589, he explained that God had entrusted him with the rule of the realm for the benefit of the many peoples under his care. Under the Carolingian rulers, this idea of royal responsibility grew even stronger and influenced later generations. Kings were expected to care about the moral life of their subjects, about correct worship and belief, and about the spread of learning so that people would understand their faith properly. They called on their subjects to join them in the effort to build a Christian society where justice and good order were maintained. What people expected of a king in the early Middle Ages was not always the same. The answer would differ if we spoke of a Burgundian ruler around 500, a Kentish king in the 6th century, a Visigothic king in 7th century Spain, or Charlemagne at the end of the 8th century. This is partly because their circumstances were different, and partly because the kinds of sources we have for each case vary. Our picture of kingship is filtered through what has survived in writing. By the time detailed accounts of rulers in the successor kingdoms were written, from the 6th century onward, the norms and expectations of kingship may already have changed compared to the 5th century. Still, from their recorded actions in narrative histories, we can form an idea of what kings believed they could do and what their followers thought was normal. Actual practice could shape later theory, while theoretical writing could in turn refine and justify methods of control and punishment. Some of the earliest windows onto these rulers are their law codes and the first narratives about them. These include hostile descriptions of persecuting Vandal kings in North Africa, lively stories of Merovingian rulers in Gaul, and praise-filled accounts of Visigothic kings once they had adopted Catholic belief. Even though their authors differed in style and opinion, they shared certain assumptions about the wide powers of a king and the areas in which he acted. In making laws, early medieval kings most closely resembled Roman emperors. Yet the warrior side of their role remained fundamental. Many rulers owed their position and continued authority to their success in war. Qualities such as courage, military skill, quick judgment, and the ability to win battles inspired loyalty and trust. A strong king made people feel protected, and this sense of security was a major part of his political strength. A capable ruler used all available tools of good government to reinforce his control. At the same time, power could be abused. A king could step outside accepted limits, rule through fear, and become a tyrant, placing himself above the law instead of acting as its guardian. Within the royal household, the king was not alone. He was supported by the queen. Her position and influence seem to have depended a lot on how succession worked in each kingdom. In some realms, such as that of the Visigoths, and to a lesser degree, the Lombards, kings were in theory elected, and no single family managed to keep the throne for generation after generation. In other places, especially among the Franks under the Merovingians and later the Carolingians, rule usually passed from father to son, or to several sons who shared the inheritance. In Ireland, kingship also followed lines of male descent, but often through one chosen son rather than all of them. In the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, rulers were normally chosen from the men of a leading royal kin group, and only during the later 9th century did a clear pattern of father-to-son succession emerge in the House of Wessex, and then become standard for the kings of England. The Picts may have been unusual because their kingship seems, at least in some traditions, to have followed a line of descent through women, though this is much argued over. Because of these different systems of succession, queens did not always have the same visibility or importance. Among the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, and the Visigoths, queens often appear less central in the written record than in Frankish or Byzantine sources. This may reflect real differences, but it may also be due to the kinds of narratives that survive. Even so, we know that some queens in Lombard Italy, such as Theodelinda and possibly Gundeperga, played major roles in the 7th century. In the Frankish and Byzantine worlds, a queen's standing was closely tied to her ability to provide male heirs. In the Byzantine Empire, the emperor's consort held the title Augusta. She was usually his wife, but if he was widowed, he might grant the title to a daughter or to another woman, because a prominent female figure was considered necessary for court rituals and public life. In Western kingdoms, the queen also seems to have been in charge of the domestic side of the palace, overseen household officials, and controlled resources connected with feeding and maintaining the court. Many charters, letters, and stories also show queens acting as mediators, peacemakers, patrons, and sometimes as plotters. Goiswintha, queen of the Visigoths, is said to have worked with one bishop against the Catholic supporters of King Recared. Rosamund, queen of the Lombards, is remembered as the woman who organized the killing of her husband, King Alboin. A queen had direct personal access to the king and could speak to him in private in a way few others could. Strong and determined women took full advantage of this. Their influence reached into the life of the church as well, through friendships with important clergy, grants of land and wealth to churches and monasteries, and encouragement of particular writers and scholars. In this cultural and religious patronage, early medieval queens followed the example of the powerful empresses of the 5th century Roman Empire. We can see this both in Theodelinda, queen of the Lombards, who supported churches and promoted Catholic belief, and in Judith, wife of the Emperor Louis the Pious, who was active in court politics and patronage in the 9th century. It is also notable how many queens acted as regents for underage sons or grandsons. Amalasuintha ruled on behalf of Athalaric among the Ostrogoths in the 6th century. In the Frankish kingdoms, queens such as Brunhild, Balthild, and Nantachild governed for young Merovingian kings like Theudebert II, Theuderic II, Clothar III, and Clovis II. In Byzantium, the Empress Irene ruled for her son Constantine and later took power herself. In Germany during the late 10th century, Adelaide and Theophano ruled in the name of the child king Otto III. Other royal women, including daughters, sisters, and aunts of kings, sometimes exercised similar influence. Many were formally removed from direct politics by marriages to lesser nobles or by entering religious life. But in practice, they often controlled rich monasteries and maintained close ties to the royal court. For example, Gisela the Younger, and Rotrud, sister and daughters of Charlemagne, oversaw the great convent of Chelles, while staying deeply involved with royal affairs. The female relatives of Otto I held powerful abbeys such as Quedlinburg and Gandersheim. These monasteries served as luxurious lodging places for the traveling court. Through their control of such houses, royal women helped shape the movement and presence of the king and his household, and thus played a key role in the government of the Saxon kingdom. The political behavior of early medieval societies can be studied by looking both at what people did and at what they expected from leaders. Narrative sources such as histories of the Franks, Goths, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons, and the many sets of annals from across Western Europe strongly influence how we view power in this period. These texts highlight two main themes: agreement and cooperation on the one hand, and physical and social closeness to the ruler on the other. Modern historians have often discussed the idea of consensus, mainly in relation to the Frankish kingdoms, and sometimes have wrongly treated it as simply borrowed from late Roman politics. In fact, it was a basic feature of early medieval government. Consensus shines a light on how rulers and noble elites worked together. It shows the mix of dependence, support, rivalry, and self-interest in relations between kings and great men. It is hard to state fixed rules for how Carolingian politics functioned, and it is even harder to do so for other regions, because many royal decrees, especially Frankish and Italian capitularies, seem to respond to particular problems instead of laying out a clear long-term policy. Even so, local politics often mirrored court politics. Powerful local men, sometimes called potentes, actively took part in government at all levels and helped carry out royal decisions. Kingship was not just a system. It was also about the qualities of the person who held the office. The strength, judgment, and resources of individual kings mattered as much as structures. It is true that the institution could survive child kings, gaps between rulers, or regencies in which others governed on behalf of a weak or absent monarch. In such cases, the framework of kingship continued even if the king himself could not control events. However, if a king or a series of kings pushed the system too hard for selfish gain, or more commonly, if they were not strong enough to use its tools effectively, their dynasty could fall. We see this among the Visigoths and the Merovingian Franks, where the royal line collapsed, although the idea of kingship itself remained and new families took the throne. 3 examples help show how rulers were chosen and how they were given the means to rule. Among the Lombards in 584, after 10 years of being ruled mainly by regional dukes, these dukes decided to appoint a king again. They agreed to give up half of their property so that the new ruler would have enough resources to support his household, his officials, and the people who served him at court. When Pippin III took the royal title among the Franks in the middle of the 8th century, he did so, the sources say, with the advice and agreement of all the leading Franks. Later, in 888, after the death of a West Frankish king, and with the rightful heir still an infant, the nobles chose one of their own, Odo, Count of Paris, because he had shown courage and leadership in defending them against Viking attacks. In each case, people with power judged both who should lead and what he needed to perform that role. Loyalty to a ruler had to be created and maintained. It could grow from personal trust and shared experience in war and council, but it could also be encouraged by rewards. Gifts of gold, swords, horses, jewelry, land, and official positions helped bind followers to the king, and at the same time increased their own power and prestige. When followers chose a ruler and proclaimed him king, they also publicly committed themselves to him. Charlemagne, for example, required his subjects to swear formal oaths of loyalty, both while he was king and again after he became emperor. His successors did the same. These oaths stated clearly the mutual duties that tied followers and lord together. A typical oath promised faithful help, honesty, support in advice and in action, and the intention that the ruler should be able to carry out the authority that, in their eyes, had been given to him by God for the good and salvation of his people. Closeness to the king was another crucial factor in power. Holding a title such as duke or count, or bearing honorable ranks granted by the ruler gave status, but being personally near the king at court could matter just as much. Those who enjoyed this closeness received not only honor and protection, but also practical benefits, such as the king's backing in lawsuits or disputes and extra grants of treasure or land. It was in the interest of the leading class as a whole that the king should remain strong enough to enforce his will, because their own rights and privileges depended on it. At the same time, proximity to the ruler was dangerous. Court politics always contained rival groups. A noble could fall from grace, lose his lands and wealth, or even be killed. Merovingian and Visigothic rulers, in particular, did not hesitate to execute those they suspected of betrayal or disloyalty. Men thus shifted sides, supported different candidates for the throne, or went into exile and offered their skills to foreign rulers. Throughout Europe, we find references to such exiles, including individuals who traveled far from home to serve new lords. One Viking Age memorial stone from Sweden speaks of two brothers who died while serving abroad, showing how movement and service at distant courts formed part of this world. Power culture combined personal intimacy with serious responsibility and real risk. Life at court was not only about formal politics. Shared activities like feasting, hunting, riding, and even bathing together were part of how kingship worked. The king's public enjoyment of such pastimes with his followers strengthened bonds and displayed his wealth and authority. One writer notes that Charlemagne liked to bathe in the hot springs at Aachen with his companions, sometimes with 100 or more men in the pool at once. Another tells us that Louis the Pious loved hunting, especially in late summer when the deer were fat, and spent long periods at the chase before turning to hunt wild boar. Many royal residences and palaces seem to have been designed in part as hunting bases, such as Thionville in the Ardennes or Tamworth in Mercia. Courts of the Lombards, Carolingians, Anglo-Saxons, Ottonian German rulers, Byzantine emperors, and the emirs of Cordoba also became centers of learning and art at different times. They promoted scholars, poets, and artists, and supported the copying of books and the creation of fine objects. Wealthy bishops and nobles often imitated this patronage in their own households. Inside kingdoms, rival claims to the throne often led to civil wars. In such times, defeated factions became harder to control, and kings could not simply impose their will everywhere. In the 10th century, rulers in France and Italy had less direct reach over all parts of their theoretical realm than earlier Carolingian kings had enjoyed, so they became less central to the ambitions of the great families around them. In the German kingdom, rulers could exercise firmer command in some regions, but still did not fully control every area. Only in some comparatively small kingdoms, like England and Leon Castile, both influenced by Carolingian models, did kings in the 10th century manage to strengthen their direct authority over their subjects, though even their recent expansion of territory made governing difficult. In much of Latin Europe at this time, the real holders of public power, those who presided over courts, enforced peace, and organized local government, were dukes and counts rather than kings. They followed Carolingian patterns of rule, but on a narrower stage. Men who gathered at court served both as advisors to the king and as officers within the palace administration. One should not try to divide early medieval government too sharply into separate categories. In many realms, lay nobles and clerics shared responsibility for public affairs, even if they had different primary roles. In the Visigothic kingdom, church councils not only dealt with religious matters, but also passed rules against political plots and rebellion. In Anglo-Saxon England, kings hosted meetings at which papal legates addressed both churchmen and secular leaders. In the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, and under the Lombards before the Frankish conquest, bishops did not seem to play such a direct part in political decision-making. Lombard laws, for example, refer mainly to secular judges and advisors. Under the Carolingian rulers, we see especially clearly how flexible official roles could be. A court notary might also be a priest and a learned scholar. A bishop had to care for his diocese in religious and material ways, but he might also serve as royal advisor, as an inspector or envoy, and as a military or diplomatic leader. A count might judge cases, lead troops on campaign, manage both royal and private estates, and support churches and monasteries. Clerics played a large role in government, while lay nobles often gained control of abbeys as a reward for their service. In such cases, they enjoyed the income of the monastery, but were also expected to protect its members and interests. In the expansion and consolidation of the Frankish kingdom, both clerics and laymen sought similar kinds of advancement and displayed similar signs of power and wealth. Although we know this best from Frankish sources, similar patterns can be seen elsewhere. Church and secular politics were deeply linked in the councils of Toledo in the Visigothic realm. Bishops in Armagh, London, York, and Canterbury were central figures in both religious and political life in Ireland and England. Italian clergy played a strong part in stabilizing Frankish rule after the conquest of the Lombard kingdom. Ottonian rulers in Germany relied heavily on both lay lords and leading churchmen. Offa of Mercia tried to establish his own archbishop within his kingdom. The Bulgar ruler, Boris, negotiated with the papacy about creating a high-ranking church leader in his land. These examples all show how tightly religious and political ambitions were woven together. In most early medieval kingdoms, there was a group of officials responsible for administration, supported by notaries who drafted documents. These written texts recorded royal decisions, answered petitions, and confirmed grants and rights. Many survive as royal charters. Their standardized form, which goes back to late Roman practice, shows the strength of Roman influence on early medieval government. References and later copies indicate that the Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Lombards, and Visigoths all used written documents in administration and law. Original documents from before the 8th century survive only from the Merovingian Frankish kingdoms, where they continue late Roman patterns, and from Anglo-Saxon England, where Roman-style documentation was reintroduced by Christian missionaries. These originals preserve details that later copies sometimes omit. All kings, however, needed a circle of trusted officials to handle such tasks at court and throughout their realms. Among the Franks, we can trace a royal writing office with an arch-chancellor and a team of notaries through the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Later, this model was copied by counts and dukes in new duchies and principalities such as Burgundy, Flanders, Lotharingia, Normandy, Aquitaine, Saxony, Bavaria, Spoleto, and Tuscany, as well as in independent kingdoms like England, the northern Spanish realms, and the states of Central and Eastern Europe. England certainly had a royal writing office by the 10th century, and perhaps earlier. The Franks also had a palace chapel with a chief chaplain and staff, who may have combined religious duties with writing and record-keeping. Some bishops were even granted special permission to leave their dioceses so that they could serve the king full-time at court. The large number of letters, laws, charters, and orders produced at these royal centers shows that writing and literacy were deeply rooted in the political life of early medieval Europe. The eastward expansion of the Carolingian realm led to major changes in administration beyond the immediate court. The king strengthened local contact and control through a network of counts acting as royal agents. In addition, from the later 8th century onward, a special system of royal envoys known as missi dominici was introduced and reorganized. These royal envoys usually worked in pairs, normally a count and a bishop, and were given responsibility for a defined region. They traveled through their districts, hearing complaints, checking that local officials observed royal orders, and ensuring that justice was done. One such envoy, Theodulf of Orleans, wrote a poem warning judges against taking bribes and favoring the rich. Another writer describes how people in Italy trusted the authority of a Frankish royal envoy named Wala and appealed to him when they sought fair judgment. Other kingdoms developed their own arrangements that resembled the Frankish system in some ways, though the need for written records varied. In Iceland, leading landowners known as godar gathered with others at a central assembly called the Thing to discuss laws and resolve disputes. In eastern Brittany, local leaders called maktirns presided over village meetings and sometimes initiated legal action. In Lombard Italy, administration was more formal. Local officials, known as gastalds, could govern a city instead of a duke or count or oversee royal estates in a given territory. In the Byzantine Empire, there was a large, complex central bureaucracy staffed by professional civil servants, and provinces organized into units that combined military and administrative functions. Senior officials reported back to the capital and were paid from the center. Of course, not every official was honest or efficient. Some were corrupt, lazy, or incompetent. But it would be unfair to judge an entire system only by its worst examples. In general, early medieval administrative structures, with their focus on carrying out the king's will and maintaining order and justice, were flexible enough to adapt to different local conditions. They could also be strengthened and extended by rulers who wanted more control. The king's physical presence was itself a sign of power. The court was wherever the king happened to be. In some kingdoms, such as Ireland, Scotland, England, Lombard Italy, Visigothic Spain, Bulgaria, or Denmark, rulers had main centers that served as royal seats and sometimes as religious sites as well. Places like Tara and Dublin, Dunkeld, Winchester, London, York, Pavia, Toledo, Pliska, or Gelling acted as capitals and as locations for central administration and palace complexes. At the same time, many kings moved around their realms. Their courts were itinerant, staying in various royal estates, city palaces, country residences, and hunting lodges. Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, for example, often stayed at Thionville, Aachen, Frankfurt, Paderborn, and Regensburg. Hosting the court required careful planning for food, fodder, and lodging. The king and his entourage were also guests of bishops and abbots in important sees and monasteries. Plans for great monasteries, like that of St. Gall, show special quarters for high-ranking guests, as does the archaeological evidence from the monastery of San Vincenzo al Volturno in Italy. Such royal monasteries formed an essential part of the landscape of royal power, offering both material support and symbolic prestige to the traveling court. One of the most important tools of government in the early Middle Ages was the public assembly. These were large meetings where leading nobles and high churchmen came together, both in the royal center and in local regions. At such gatherings, people settled disputes, brought petitions, took collective decisions, and approved new laws. Often these meetings took place in spring, at the same time as the army was being called up for a campaign. In 7th century Spain, for example, Visigothic kings ruled largely through the big councils that met regularly in Toledo. Church councils in general also acted as places where secular elites could meet and discuss wider political matters. By the late 7th century, in the Frankish lands, a form of public court called the placetum had developed. It continued well into the 11th century as a regular setting where legal conflicts were heard in front of a local audience that included landowners and other important men. This way of doing politics clearly drew on Roman traditions, especially in its use of public language about the community and public power. The topics discussed at assemblies in the 8th and 9th centuries can be seen in the records that survive. These include royal decrees, known as capitularies, the acts of church councils, and single-page charters that record particular judgments. Together, they show how wide the scope of such meetings was. The council held at Frankfurt in 794, for example, condemned the idea that Christ was only an adopted Son of God, rejected the Byzantine position on religious images, set rules for weights and measures, and issued instructions about church discipline and lay religious behavior. A general capitulary issued in 802 dealt with many aspects of royal power, punishment of crimes, and the running of justice. In the Kingdom of Italy, in the 10th and 11th centuries, more than 300 records from public court sessions show emperors or their agents presiding over legal cases. In Iceland, around the year 1000, the National Assembly known as the Althing decided that the country would officially accept Christianity. In England, royal charters list numerous lay and clerical witnesses. These witness lists reveal that kings often summoned gatherings of leading men as a way of strengthening their control. The various law codes produced by early medieval kingdoms are also the end result of discussion between kings and their great men in such settings. Many key features of early medieval legal life and government, especially those developed or formalized under the Carolingian rulers, shaped Europe far beyond the early Middle Ages. Yet modern scholarship has often focused more on the legal changes of the 11th and 12th centuries and forgotten how much earlier foundations mattered. The Church was deeply involved in this early achievement. Churchmen took part in administration and government, and religious ideals were woven into the political thinking of secular rulers. Kings and nobles cared about spiritual questions just as clergy did. The later idea of a sharp divide between church and state does not fit this period. Many leading church figures were also strong defenders of law. Hincmar, Archbishop of Reims, in the 9th century, insisted that all people, including nobles and rulers, were bound by law. He explained that some laws were to be carried out by kings and their officers in governing their regions, and that royal decrees made with the agreement of the ruler's followers had equal force. He also repeated the view, drawn from earlier Christian thinkers, that once laws were agreed, judges were no longer free to argue about them, only to apply them. The clearest line of continuity with the Roman world is found in law and in the use of writing for legal purposes. Roman law did not suddenly collapse. It was gradually adjusted to new realities. Early medieval law in the West had several layers. First, there was Roman law in the form of the Theodosian Code, written in Latin in the 5th century. Shortened versions of this code circulated later, the best known being a Visigothic collection often called the Roman Law of the Visigoths. The great legal collection of the Emperor Justinian, produced in the 6th century, was also known in the West, but not widely used until much later, although in the Byzantine world, it became the standard legal reference and was translated and taught in law schools. Second, there were the so-called Germanic laws of peoples such as the Burgundians, Visigoths, Alemanni, Bavarians, Lombards, Anglo-Saxons, Franks, Saxons, and Frisians. Except for the English laws, these texts were also written in Latin and built on Roman models in layout and style. Many of their rules came from late Roman practice or developed from it, while other parts reflected local customs or new decisions. Most of these laws were first written down under specific rulers with the help of their main advisors. A third layer was church law. Rules found in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, influenced later church legislation. Decisions of early church councils, rulings by bishops of Rome, and Roman imperial laws concerning church matters formed what became known as canon law. During the early Middle Ages, different regions produced their own collections of canon law according to what they thought they needed. Some were made for use in the Frankish or Visigothic kingdoms. At the end of the 8th century, an attempt was made to introduce a more uniform collection with papal support, but pushed strongly by Frankish rulers. In the 10th and 11th centuries, more collections were made by churchmen such as Regino of Prum and Burchard of Worms. These later works, together with earlier collections, helped shape the more formal codification of canon law in the 12th century. At the same time, churchmen north of the Alps often reacted strongly, sometimes critically, to papal attempts to impose uniform standards. A fourth component of early medieval law was fresh royal legislation. This includes the laws issued by English kings from the late 9th century onward, and the law collections known as capitularies, produced by the Carolingians in the late 8th and 9th centuries. In the 820s, a man named Ansegisus collected and arranged the capitularies of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious. His version circulated widely and helped spread a shared legal framework across the Frankish world. When modern scholars discuss medieval law, they often focus on written law. Yet it is hard to know how far judges used written texts in everyday practice. Charters, dispute records, and reports from public courts give occasional glimpses. In principle, legal norms might have been remembered orally by each adult male in the community. In reality, the habit of writing down legal decisions probably encouraged the growth of legal specialists. This is visible, for example, in northern Italy in the 10th century, where people trained in law can be identified. Already in late Roman times, there had been a gap between what the law books said and what happened in practice. The same was true in the early Middle Ages. Law was constantly reinterpreted and reshaped according to changing social conditions. Carolingian rulers frequently ordered judges to follow written law instead of relying only on their own judgment. These orders suggest that many judges often did not consult law books, even though they may still have judged according to commonly accepted norms. Large numbers of copies of the different law codes survive, especially from the late 8th to the 10th centuries. This suggests that these texts were widely copied and distributed along with Carolingian decrees. Many manuscripts show that individuals created their own legal handbooks, probably for personal or local use. A significant group of law books from the Frankish world seems to have been produced by scribes working under the chief of the royal writing office. This implies that the king and his staff took the lead in copying and spreading royal decisions and assembly rulings. In both England and Francia, Some law collections can also be linked with particular senior churchmen who used them in their own territories. The spread of copies of law codes, royal capitularies, canon law, and Roman codes, both in full and in shortened versions, shows that people saw written law as authoritative. These texts were meant to guide legal procedure and help judges decide cases. Early medieval rulers guaranteed the working of law and justice as part of their political role. Roman law, the laws of different peoples, and Carolingian decrees all influenced later legal developments in Western monarchies and supported the emergence of professional lawyers in the High Middle Ages. Within the early kingdoms, law marked political loyalty and social order more than it expressed ethnic identity. It was above all a sign of belonging to a specific political community. Everyday legal transactions between people and institutions were written down in charters. These documents recorded settlements of disputes over land, sales, exchanges, donations, rents, and the freeing of slaves. They show that legal procedures were carried out and recorded in writing. Charters followed Roman-style models but were gradually adapted over time. They were written in Latin and used standard phrases that matched different types of legal action. Collections of such phrases, called formularies, were compiled to help scribes draft charters correctly. In legal hearings, judges and witnesses drew on written law, long-standing custom, written documents like charters, and spoken testimony. Written and oral evidence worked together and depended on each other. Charters provide one of the strongest lines of continuity in social and legal life from the 6th century into the Central Middle Ages. They reveal how men and women defended their rights and set out claims to land and inheritance. Charters that record donations to churches and monasteries also show how religious belief and practical concerns were closely linked. Such gifts expressed piety, but also tied local elites to religious houses that were deeply anchored in their communities. The basic patterns of how charters were used and produced were established early on in all the kingdoms of Latin Europe. Later, as new regions such as Scandinavia and Bohemia were conquered, converted, and drawn into the Christian world, these same practices, along with Latin writing itself, were introduced there too. When we look at the resources that supported government, especially money and military service, the differences between the Roman Empire and early medieval kingdoms become most obvious. The Visigoths, and until about the year 600, the Franks maintained some kind of tax system, but taxes became less central to royal power over time. The most important rewards for loyalty and service were now grants of land. Titles such as count or duke meant little without substantial private estates and bands of armed followers tied to those estates. Armies in most kingdoms were, in practice, made up of these private groups. They also expected land in return for their service. This shift meant that it became more costly to be a great noble in the 7th century than it had been in the Roman world, and the ambitions of aristocrats increasingly focused on building strong local bases as well as serving the ruler. This set the pattern for land-based politics that would dominate European life up to at least the mid-13th century. At the same time, we still know too little about rewards in the form of plunder, luxury goods, weapons, animals, or slaves, which also played a major role alongside land. When rulers distributed land to gain support, they weakened their own future bargaining power because they had less to give later. Since kings and great nobles drew on similar kinds of resources, they often competed on equal terms. This encouraged the decentralization of power in many regions. Roman government had been built on a heavy and complex tax system. Most taxes were based on land and its agricultural output. Some scholars estimate that taxes may have taken more than half of the surplus produced above basic subsistence level. Tax was not the only source of state income. In some places, the state's own estates and their produce also supported administration. Even so, taxes were vital to pay for public works, such as roads and bridges, to maintain the standing army, and to pay soldiers. Money was the key medium of public finance. Stable coinage was therefore crucial. After a period of serious inflation in the late 3rd century and fall in the value of some coins, taxes began to be levied in kind and later in gold. The tax system was very harsh on the poor. Wealthy people often managed to avoid the full burden. Those who collected the taxes, especially city councilors drawn from local elites, often kept part of what they raised. Cities were responsible for collecting tax from the surrounding countryside, and this often set public demands in direct competition with private rents taken by landlords. In the early Middle Ages, the paths of the eastern and western parts of the Old Empire diverged. In the Byzantine Empire, the state kept a strong grip on coinage and taxation. Gold tax remained central to the cycle of collection and spending, even if trade played a limited role. In the West, new rulers tried at first to use Roman fiscal structures, but increasingly they paid officials and supported warriors with land rather than with money. Coinage systems simplified, and the role of tax in everyday government shrank. Indirect taxes rose in importance across the Middle Ages. Charges on transport and on the sale of goods were, at least up to the mid-9th century, reserved to kings and their agents, and provided significant income. Another key feature of early medieval government was the practice of granting immunity. Immunity placed a person, their lands, and their dependents beyond the reach of ordinary royal officials. In principle, they still owed loyalty and service to the king, but responsibility for taxation, justice, and raising troops among the population was handed over by the king to the holder of the immunity. Granting such a privilege was a striking act of self-limitation by the ruler. Yet it was also a way for the king to show his power, because only he could grant such exceptions. Most immunities went to churches and monasteries, and thus also shaped the boundaries between sacred and secular space. Over time, the spread of immunities may have undermined land taxes altogether, although documented immunities appear mainly after land tax had already faded. In practice, services owed by immunists and the principles of public taxation belonged to two different systems. What did continue from late Roman times was the central role of great lay and church nobles as necessary partners in rule. With no permanent standing army, as Rome had once had, the tasks of organizing war and military service shifted more and more to these magnates. From the late 7th century onward, kings increasingly depended on the unity and shared identity of warrior elites built through military success. In the Frankish world, from the time of Charles Martel, and even more under Pippin III and Charlemagne, warfare and expansion became a normal and repeated feature of life. Territorial conquest brought new lands that could be granted to warriors and supporters. Historians have rightly pointed out the growing strength of the Frankish army, made up of professional soldiers, often on horseback, whose income came from estates they held as benefices from royal or church lands. The scale of military and public spending required to support such forces called for a level of organization in logistics and economy not seen in Western Europe since the days of the unified Roman Empire. This efficiency is clear in large campaigns fought at the same time on different fronts, in ambitious engineering projects to link major rivers by canal, and in the careful planning that required groups of church estates to work together to supply labor and materials for royal building works, such as the palace at Aachen in the early 9th century. Although Carolingian kings still ruled through great nobles, they also aimed to strengthen the church and give it new tools and resources. The political economy of their period was dominated by the effort to centralize and control labor, farming equipment, and food production, so that these could be directed to royal needs. One of the most important changes was the new way in which royal and church estates were managed and supervised. Without a permanent standing army like that of Rome, and unlike Byzantium, which maintained smaller professional forces, Western kingdoms organized military service in principle as a duty of free men. This general levy remained the ideal until the 9th century. Around the year 800, Charlemagne introduced rules that only men who held a certain amount of independent land had to serve in person. One decision set the minimum at 4 standard holdings of land. Others who owned less land were expected to pool resources so that one fully equipped fighter could be sent, or more commonly, to pay contributions to a great lord who provided troops on their behalf. Alongside such military obligations, great men owed rulers regular gifts, which were customary annual offerings. These gifts were not Roman in origin, but formed an important part of how loyalty and service were expressed and rewarded. The main unit of money used for such payments in Western Europe was the silver penny, often called the denarius. It was first struck in parts of the Frankish realm around the later 7th century, and soon after in Anglo-Saxon England. Its weight matched that of the small gold coin it replaced, and so had a significantly lower face value. This may have made smaller-scale trade easier, though scholars still debate this point. Under the Carolingians, the standard weight was slightly increased. Over time, the West moved toward a single metal coinage system based first on debased gold and then on silver. Early on, rulers imitated Roman designs and kept some aspects of imperial coinage. Later, distinct coins bearing the names and symbols of Visigothic, Lombard, English, and Frankish rulers appeared. The degree of royal control over coinage varied. In Merovingian Gaul, coinage seems to have been produced mainly in small local mints with limited output, perhaps under looser central control than later. By the 8th century, however, royal authority over coin production is more obvious. In the northwest of Europe, long-distance trade was especially supported by Frisian and, to a lesser extent, Anglo-Saxon pennies, whose issue appears closely tied to commercial activity. Frankish rulers linked their rules about coins to other controls on economic life. They tried to stop private people from taking tolls for themselves, from cheating with false weights and measures, and from using coinage outside royal control. When they spoke of false money, they usually meant coins made in mints that were not under the king's authority, rather than crude fakes made of poor metal. They also punished people who refused to accept proper coins. At first sight, this seems strange, but it probably hides a deeper resistance to royal power among some parts of the population. If we look at where coins were made and where they have been found, it seems that the eastern regions of the Frankish kingdom under Louis the German had an economy that was only lightly based on money. East of the Rhine, people used more labor services and fewer money rents, while west of the Rhine, payments in coins were more common. Yet money still moved quickly and widely, especially in the trading zones around the North Sea. The Franks were very effective in keeping foreign coins out of their lands. Under Louis the Pious, most of Western Europe inside the Frankish Empire used a single basic type of coin, and outside money was largely excluded. Only England and the Principality of Benevento lay outside this system, though English silver pennies were made to the same weight as Frankish pennies after Offa's reforms. Venice even produced coins with Louis's religious motto in its own mint, alongside its local issues, to make trade easier. In both England and the Frankish realms, putting the king's name and symbols on coins helped to advertise royal authority, although we still do not know exactly how many coins were made. Coinage could also provide a fast way to gather tribute, even if, in many cases, payments in wine, animals, and grain were added. When rulers paid the Vikings large sums to go away, much silver left their lands and was melted down into bullion. From the later 9th century, control over coinage slipped from kings toward great nobles and bishops. These local powers often reduced the metal content and weight of coins to make more pieces from the same amount of silver. After about 900, the history of money reflects the different political directions taken in each kingdom. In Germany, Saxon rulers encouraged the spread of mints into eastern regions and into new kingdoms such as Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia. But these mints were usually run by local lords. In France, coin standards varied from region to region by the end of the 10th century. In Anglo-Saxon England, on the other hand, royal control over coinage remained strong and even grew. By the middle of the 10th century, England had the most tightly organized, though fairly self-contained, monetary system in Western Europe. In some early kingdoms, such as the Lombard and Visigothic realms, family treasure does not seem to have played a big part in struggles for power. In the Frankish world, it was very important. After the deaths of Pippin II and his son Grimoald, rivals seized Pippin's widow and took control of the family hoard. Charles Martel later recovered this treasure and used it to rebuild his power. Charlemagne did something similar when he captured the enormous wealth of the Avars at the end of the 8th century. He used it to shower gifts on neighbors like Offa of Mercia and to reward loyal followers at court. Over time, however, competition for key offices such as countships, abbeys, and bishoprics became more central to high politics than the royal treasury itself. Alongside the practical business of ruling, people in the early Middle Ages also developed strong ideas about what good rule should look like. An Irish legal text known as Crith Gablach, for instance, sets out a weekly timetable for a king. According to this text, a proper ruler should spend one day giving out ale to show hospitality, another day judging disputes among his people, another on games like chess, another on hunting with hounds, another on enjoying his wife's company, another on horse racing, and another again on legal judgments. This list may sound playful, but it reflects serious expectations. A king should be generous, just, sociable, brave, and active in both warlike and peaceful pursuits. In the later Roman Empire, the emperor's presence and power were everywhere felt. From Constantine's time onward, imperial ideology became more openly monarchical and was closely tied to the Christian image of a universe ruled by a single all-powerful god. Court ceremony grew more elaborate. The emperor's arrivals and victories were marked by carefully staged events. Strict rules governed access to him. Writers described these practices and linked them to Christian ideas about authority. Law codes set out the emperor's legal power, while Christian imperial imagery influenced how later rulers thought about their own position. These ideas spread not only through texts, but also through art, ritual, and the way kings presented themselves in public. In early medieval royal images, the ruler appears with both sacred and practical symbols. In surviving portraits from the 9th century onward, kings are shown with crowns, staffs, and books, and often with the hand of God above them. In some pictures of Charles the Bald and of the Ottonian rulers, the king is surrounded by secular and church nobles, personifications of key virtues such as justice and courage, and symbolic figures representing the lands under his rule. Later, royal portraits across Europe followed similar patterns. A famous example from 11th century England shows Queen Emma and King Canute presenting a golden cross to a monastery. The message is clear. Rulers are God's chosen servants who protect and support the church. These images match what we find in royal rituals. From the 9th century, ceremonies of royal inauguration and coronation became more formalized in the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon worlds. They drew on earlier prayers for kings, such as those used in Visigothic Spain when a ruler went to war. These rituals present the king as God's representative on earth, charged with defending justice and peace for the Christian people. Both Franks and Visigoths, taking their model from Old Testament kings, adopted the practice of anointing rulers with holy oil. Among the Franks, anointing was first used to strengthen the position of the new Carolingian dynasty, when Pippin III replaced the Merovingians. Later, it became standard in Europe for kings to be anointed as part of an elaborate religious service. Ruling families also increased awareness of their special status by ordering prayers to be said for them and their ancestors on fixed days throughout the year in churches and monasteries. Christian ideas of kingship and sometimes broader dreams of a united Christian empire were also set out in teaching texts known as mirrors for princes. Several such works survive from the 9th century. They borrowed from earlier Christian thinkers and biblical models to instruct rulers on right conduct. These treatises, in turn, influenced later political thought. At the same time, other early medieval writings, especially histories and law codes, stress the importance of loyalty, good lordship, and mutual obligation between ruler and followers. As one modern historian has pointed out, political thought in this period appears not only in formal theories, but also in practical, sometimes improvised responses to real problems and to gaps between ideals and reality. Across early medieval Europe, cultures of power and systems of control varied widely from place to place. Yet there were also common themes. Over time, political ideas moved from the simple autocracy of the late Roman Empire through the mixed structures of the early successor kingdoms toward a view of the realm as both a territory and a community. Kings were seen as stewards of a Christian trust, sharing power and responsibility to different degrees with lay and church elites. This gradual development laid much of the groundwork for the political thought and practice of the later Middle Ages. Aristocrats and peasants will be compared as two main social groups. They were never fully separate, and in some regions their lives were closer than in almost any period since 200 BC. However, without treating them as different categories, peasant communities easily vanish from discussion because they are poorly documented, even though they made up nearly 95% of the people. Working within this basic division, European societies may be grouped into three broad worlds: those formed after Rome collapsed in the west, those where the empire continued in the east, and the northern societies that had never been part of Rome. Such a large time span forces generalization, yet this separation allows both regional variety and wider social patterns to be seen more clearly. This approach leaves out certain parts of society. Focus will fall on secular life and lay society, while religious groups and spiritual activity belong to a different context. Craftsmen and traders fit mainly into economic discussion rather than social structure, because their numbers were low and they did not form a sharply defined class. Archaeology shows skilled production in metalwork and pottery, but most craft workers seem to have been part-time and socially close to peasants, while a few specialized roles such as goldsmiths and coin makers stood nearer to the aristocracy. Even in regions where towns survived, like northern Italy, farming remained the foundation of life for almost everyone. Any description of society must acknowledge the dominance of agriculture. The late Roman world around the year 400 was still wealthy and relatively stable, and its upper class can be divided into four overlapping groups. One consisted of senatorial families, some incredibly rich, able to spend vast sums on ceremonial events or selling off estates across several provinces. A second group belonged to the imperial governing elite, drawn partly from senatorial circles and centered in Ravenna and Constantinople, though also present in older urban centers such as Rome or Antioch. A third group was formed by local city councilors, the curiales, wealthy urban families who built temples in earlier centuries and later invested heavily in churches. They felt their influence challenged by state officials, but their wealth and land ownership remained immense, usually concentrated within one city region. The fourth group belonged to the military hierarchy, with commanders playing leading roles in politics. Many came from old senatorial lines, but talented soldiers from border regions or Germanic backgrounds could rise to the top and even become emperors, despite being mocked by civilian elites for unpolished speech or lack of classical learning. Several broad observations follow from these groups. Most members of this elite, including the richest, belonged to civilian rather than military circles, which makes the Roman upper class unusual in pre-industrial history. Their identity rested on education, literary culture, and comfort rather than battlefield glory or hunting skill. Refinement meant being able to recite classical authors and compose respectable verses, living in houses with mosaics, frescoes, marble decoration, and heated floors. Lavish food, clothing, and urban sociability defined status. Another key feature was the close link between social rank and public office. Even ancient noble families needed careers in administration or ceremonial roles to remain fully recognized. Some chose religious life, especially as bishops, but the church in late antiquity still shared imperial values and worked hand in hand with civic government. Urban settings shaped aristocratic identity. Public life unfolded in forums, basilicas, baths, and cathedrals, and cultured behavior was understood as city-based behavior. Country estates offered rest and leisure, not an alternative way of life. Wealth came from land, but open interest in production was considered vulgar. Villas across the western provinces reflect this seasonal rhythm of urban business and rural retreat. Church leaders inherited this urban tradition and often defended it. This world, however, was changing. Some aristocrats drifted away from city life, others leaned toward military activity, and still others turned to ecclesiastical careers. In the generations after Rome weakened, civic aristocracy faded, and secular elites became increasingly shaped by warfare, lordship, and landholding. Wealth still mattered, but now alongside descent, military ability, closeness to rulers and displays of status, fine clothes, heavy feasting, and the public giving of gifts. Violence, vengeance, and personal honor were accepted parts of noble conduct. These new elites lived more often in rural settings than in towns, spent heavily on ornaments and loyalty networks, and rarely invested in grand architecture as Roman aristocrats once had. The society just described looks very different from the civilian upper class of the old Roman world, apart from one shared feature: the importance of owning land. Yet many of the forebears of the 7th century warrior nobles had once been Roman aristocrats. In regions such as Aquitaine, where only a small number of Germanic settlers stayed for long, most leading families were still Roman in origin. Even so, Aquitanian nobles in later texts look much like other early medieval elites elsewhere. The main reason for this change is that the nature of the state had altered. In the Roman Empire, political structures were strong and held together by taxes. Service to the state brought rank, privilege, and regular payments in money. Office gave a clear and stable position and allowed the Hilder to act as a patron. Only very late, in the last years of the empire, did private armed force start to matter more. In the post-Roman kingdoms, the tax base shrank sharply. Land became the main source of wealth and authority for both kings and nobles. Any title or formal position had real value only when supported by control over estates. Power became more local, because local resources and armed followers became more important. Politics also became more personal, since a leader who could not impress his own immediate retinue could not influence anyone else. Kings and nobles lived under the same conditions and often behaved in much the same way. Another major shift was in how political communities saw themselves. Government in the new kingdoms came to be described as Frankish, Visigothic, Lombard, Burgundian, Bavarian, and so on. These ethnic labels were not always ancient or fixed. Before conquest, group identities among Germanic peoples were often loose and flexible, tied more to leaders and war bands than to clear peoples. Conquest of Roman provinces helped to harden these groups into more stable peoples, much like liquid sugar turning into solid crystals. Once a kingdom existed, its rulers and courts defined themselves as the leadership of a specific people in arms, which included free peasants as well as nobles. They relied on large public gatherings at both central and local levels, where disputes were heard and laws proclaimed. These assemblies, often called placita, drew on some Roman practices, but were wrapped in new ethnic language and symbols. To play a part in secular politics, a person increasingly had to be recognized as a Frank, a Visigoth, a Lombard, or whatever fit the local kingdom. Name choices changed to match. Families that had once used Latin names began to give their children Germanic ones. Over time, Roman names became rare in regions such as northern Gaul, and by the 8th century, the inhabitants north of the Loire commonly saw themselves simply as Franks. Similar developments took place in Italy and Spain. Through these changes, the wider lay elite took on a new shared profile. They were local lords, trained to fight, whatever other roles they also held. Family networks among nobles were wide and followed both male and female lines, just as in late Roman society. Marriages were crucial tools for spreading kin ties sideways and linking different powerful groups. This made the position of women important for family strategy, even if it did not automatically grant them freedom of action. Within this setting, some aristocratic women appear as heads of women's religious houses, especially in regions like Francia. Certain convents became centers of devotion and memory for large kin groups and functioned as semi-independent family bases. Membership in royal dynasties, by contrast, usually followed the male line, but wives and mothers of kings often came from noble families. These women could occasionally wield strong influence, especially when ruling on behalf of underage sons. In later centuries, similar patterns created a striking group of powerful mothers in many regions of Latin Europe. This does not mean that women in general enjoyed broad independence. Female power was often challenged, and public life was thought of as a male sphere. When women stepped into the open political arena, writers frequently criticized or ignored them. Even when women influenced events at the highest level, they were expected to act mainly inside the household. The surviving evidence shows that they did sometimes move into public view, but such moments were exceptional and uneasy. Noble power rested on local bases, and these could look very different from one area to another. In some districts, such as the lands between Nivelles and Liège, nearly all known landholders belonged to a single extended network, the group historians call the Pippinids, ancestors of the Carolingians. Here, authority was simple and concentrated. In other regions, especially around major royal centers like Paris, many large owners overlapped. Ancient aristocratic families, rich monasteries on the edge of the city, and the king himself all held land in the same zone. In such places, power was more competitive and filtered through multiple institutions. Private monasteries served as both spiritual houses and political bases. Nobles also sought presence at royal residences to make themselves visible and to influence decisions. In yet other regions, such as the countryside around Lucca in Italy, great estates were more scattered. Many nobles owned pieces of land mixed in with peasant holdings and possessions of churches. No single local lord could dominate the whole area without rivals. Nobles used their lands above all to build personal followings and secure allies. Their long-term goal was to attract royal notice and obtain high office, such as the rank of duke or bishop, and further grants of land. This constant competition at local level could occupy families for generations. It also posed less of a threat to kings than regions where one cluster of nobles controlled everything, unless local factions linked up across wider territories. The arrival of the Carolingian dynasty did not overturn these underlying patterns. What changed most was the scale and focus of ambition. Once a strong and unified ruling family emerged in the 8th century, noble attention centered firmly on the royal household as the main place where major decisions were made. The court became the key stage for large-scale politics, especially because Carolingian expansion into Aquitaine, northern Spain, Saxony, Bavaria, and Italy created many new posts and estates to distribute. The rewards for loyalty could be enormous. As nobles realized this during the mid-8th century, violent feuds declined for several generations. Serious factional conflict only returned when the empire stopped growing and opportunities narrowed again in the 9th century. Despite shifts in atmosphere and ideology, the basic values of the lay elite remained similar. Two trends stand out. First, large landowners increased their holdings significantly, often putting pressure on smaller neighbors. Second, they gathered more dependents around them, and the personal ties that bound these followers to their lords became more formal. Oaths of loyalty and ceremonies of service, sometimes labeled vassalage, gained a more central place in political life. In the eastern half of the empire, the story developed in a different setting but with some familiar themes. The imperial structure did not collapse there, and the capital remained in Constantinople, the largest city in Europe for many centuries. In the 5th and 6th centuries, Eastern Roman aristocratic life still resembled that of the earlier Roman world, with cities lively and civilian elites strong. A deep crisis struck in the 7th century. Tax income shrank drastically, while the need for troops remained high. A new class of frontier commanders and provincial military landholders emerged, especially on the Anatolian plateau. By the 9th century, these warriors had their own distinct culture, mixing Greek and Armenian elements with a strong pride in border warfare. This group overshadowed the traditional senatorial and city-based elites outside the capital. Urban life weakened in most regions, and many old civic roles disappeared. In cities such as Thessaloniki, officials outside the bishop and imperial representative became hard to see. Only in Constantinople did a dense civilian upper class survive, built around the palace and central bureaucracy. A wide gap opened between the learned officials of the capital and the rougher provincial military families, and tension between these groups lasted for centuries. There are clear parallels with the Western kingdoms. In both East and West, civilian aristocracies struggled under the pressure of decentralization, insecurity, and new forms of rule. Older cultural markers faded. Roman name traditions vanish rapidly in the East and are replaced by common Christian names. Tracing noble family lines across the 7th century becomes difficult, and ancestry appears to matter less than current military or administrative position. Landholding continued to be crucial, but records from this period are scarce. By around 700, a landed warrior elite dominated politics, with limited visible ties to the old senatorial world. At the same time, imperial armies were organized very differently from Western retinues. In the East, regional forces had clearly defined territories and military districts, which gave the state more direct influence over armed power. Even so, the growth of great landed families produced similar social effects. Emperors issued laws to protect free peasants from being swallowed up by powerful neighbors, much like Carolingian rulers did, but such laws had only limited impact. By 900, many leading families in the East had stable surnames and strong dynastic identities, just as their Western counterparts did a little later. The Arab imperial system, although mostly outside Europe, also shows some relevant patterns. In former Byzantine provinces such as Syria and Egypt, some Roman social habits survived longer under Arab rule than in Byzantium itself. City life remained important, and local civilian elites kept some role, even though Arab military leaders held higher status. The Arab authorities continued to levy taxes, gradually reshaping older fiscal practice. In Spain, where the Arabs arrived early in the 8th century, they rebuilt a tax-based administrative system that contrasted with the land-focused rule of the Visigoths. The new capital, Córdoba, became a major city with a large bureaucracy. Unfortunately, few documents survive from this region, so details are harder to see. Still, the broad picture looks closer to Byzantium than to most Western kingdoms. There was a strong center where civilian officials managed revenue and policy, and frontier zones where military households formed another social world influenced by a mix of Visigothic, Berber, Arab, and Islamic traditions. The tension between center and periphery persisted, even when rulers managed to tighten their control in the 10th century. When central power weakened again in the 11th century, the balance between bureaucratic and military elites shifted sharply, and unity fractured. North of the Frankish lands, several other societies developed along different lines, though they shared some broad features. They often had clearly marked warrior groups devoted to raiding, gift exchange, and personal honor, alongside large groups of free peasants. Yet these regions were highly varied. The Celtic lands of Ireland and Scotland did not work in quite the same way as Wales or Brittany. Anglo-Saxon England had a different history from Saxony or Denmark, even though its leaders had once come from those regions. The Slavic areas formed yet another cluster, with some communities accepting princely rule and others deliberately avoiding it. Because of this variety, it is easier to focus on a couple of examples. Anglo-Saxon England shows a long path from small, loose communities to a structured kingdom with strong royal power. Linking it to Latin Christian culture in the 7th century opened it to influence from the Frankish world. By the 10th century, it resembled the most successful continental models in some ways. Earlier, however, conditions were very different. Germanic settlers had taken over former Roman farmland, but political order was fragmented. In the 6th century, many tiny units seem to have existed, each with its own local leaders. Archaeology suggests that while some people were richer than others, only by the late 6th century do we clearly see a group whose wealth was based on controlling others' labor. Around the same time, the first small kingdoms began to take shape, and in the 7th century some of these expanded into larger entities like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. Even then, these polities were modest in size and resources compared with continental states. The earliest English laws already distinguish nobles from common free people. By the time of Bede's writings in the early 8th century, the elite is described as clearly aristocratic and strongly tied to warfare. Noble companions stayed near rulers because they received land grants, rich gifts, and a place at royal feasts. They could also switch their loyalty to other kings if it suited them. Interestingly, the material difference between these nobles and well-off peasants may not always have been huge, especially in the 7th century. Status may have been protected more by ritual, symbolism, and legal privilege than by visible wealth. Over the 8th century, however, landholding patterns changed, and arrangements resembling those in Francia and earlier Rome became more common. The free peasantry kept a public role, taking part in local courts, and owed military and construction service to kings. These obligations helped rulers organize large projects such as defensive dikes and fortified towns in later centuries. Noble dominance grew, but it did not completely erase the collective responsibilities and rights of the free. Feasting with one's lord was central to aristocratic culture in many regions, not just in Francia and England, but also in Wales and Ireland. Shared meals and the exchange of drink and gifts created bonds of honor and loyalty. poetry from the British world links warriors directly to the mead they drank at their lord's hall, and to the battles they fought afterwards. The feast could be both reward and trap, symbol of welcome and prelude to death in battle. Yet it remained a core part of noble identity. The northern lands also differed in how rigid their social orders became. England moved toward a fairly firm hierarchy. Ireland had an even more structured system of ranks. Scandinavian societies appear to have stayed more open for longer. Sources there are often later, but for Norway and Iceland, some patterns can be traced. These communities were formed mainly of free peasants who gathered in regional assemblies. Leaders existed and had recognized titles, but their authority over neighbors was limited. Powerful men led war bands and represented others at assemblies, yet could not easily turn this role into unchallenged lordship at the local level. Violence and feuding were common, and people expected treachery as well as loyalty. Advice preserved in wisdom verses urges caution at every doorway and warns against trusting smiles too quickly. Still, precisely because fixed power structures were weaker, free men could shift alliances and reshape their positions more easily than in heavily stratified societies. Status boundaries between richer and poorer freemen were soft, except for the firm line dividing slaves from free people. In these northern worlds, social life was harsh and tense, but also more negotiable. This stands at the furthest possible distance from the orderly, city-based civilian world of the high Roman aristocracy. Turning back to peasants, one can see just how different their situation was across Europe. In some northern societies, even leading men worked their own land and lived by stock raising. In many regions, however, peasants appear mainly through landlord records and legal texts. They are less visible and harder to study than nobles. Their ways of working the land changed with local climate, soil, and landscape. Their relationships with lords also shifted according to patterns of ownership and political control. This variety makes it difficult to set out neat types of peasant society, but a few well-documented cases give some sense of the range. One of the best-known examples comes from the lands around Paris in the early 9th century. There, a major monastery kept a detailed survey of its estates and their tenants, listing households and even children by name. Many entire villages belonged to this single church, which had received them mostly as royal gifts. In these settlements, peasants were almost all tenants, not independent owners. Society divided first between free and unfree tenants, and then more finely through the conditions attached to different plots. Some unfree tenants held holdings with lighter duties, while some free tenants worked land with heavier obligations. Mixed marriages between free and unfree people blurred these lines further, and the status of children could shift upward. Inside each village, there must have been a complex ranking among households, all under the tight oversight of monastic officials. Rules extended to small matters of daily farm work, such as cutting wood, feeding poultry, and producing cloth. This pattern of large, compact estates was once treated as typical for the period, but it now seems to have been more limited in space. In many other parts of Western Europe, landholding was far more scattered. Villages often contained plots belonging to many different owners: nobles, churches, monasteries, and peasants themselves. Around certain cities, such as Lucca in Italy, records allow some detail. There, local elites owned fields and vineyards in many villages, often alongside smallholders. These urban nobles also had their own clients and tenants. In some settlements, several such families competed with one another. In others, one dominant local family overshadowed the rest and sold land mainly within the village, keeping outside lords at bay for a long time. Gifts to churches could suddenly bring in powerful new owners and change the balance. In this type of landscape, village life was shaped as much by negotiation with neighbors as by pressure from distant landlords. City authorities still mattered and controlled formal justice, but the everyday order of rural communities rested on a mix of local notables, priests, kin groups, and tenants. In some western regions, especially along the Atlantic fringe, peasant communities had even stronger collective traditions. In eastern Brittany, for example, village districts acted as units with their own internal courts and meetings. Richer peasants and local leaders presided over these gatherings and helped settle disputes, but their authority remained limited. Large outside landowners were few, at least before some monasteries expanded their holdings. The men of a district played a regular part in witnessing transactions and guaranteeing agreements. Political and legal activity at this level gave peasant communities more shape and voice than in many other areas. Peasants in such places were less focused on building up land to the same extent as Italian smallholders, and more on defending status and autonomy within their local assemblies. In these features, they resembled in some ways the free communities of Northern Europe, even though they lived under Frankish rule and within a Christian kingdom. At this point, differences between regions can only be pushed so far. They always sit on top of certain basic similarities in peasant life. Above all, peasants were small farmers, living mostly from what they themselves produced, sometimes alongside a few full-time or part-time craftspeople. Their first worry was not the anger of a lord, but the risk of a bad harvest. A run of poor weather could destroy them more surely than any tax. It is no surprise that beliefs about weather magic were common. Some church writers complained about people who thought certain specialists could call down or stop storms. From northern Spain survives a short spell in which a monk asks that his village, its fields, vineyards, and trees be spared from hail, and that the stones turn into rain instead. This shows how directly peasants linked survival to the sky above them. Almost everywhere, peasants lived in communities tied to a specific landscape, whether tightly clustered settlements or scattered hamlets. These places mattered emotionally and politically, and more in religious terms as well. From the 8th to the 10th century, rural churches and monasteries spread across the countryside, and their feasts, processions, and rituals helped give each area a shared identity. At the same time, peasants had to live with the demands of lords, royal, noble, or ecclesiastical. Lords might own the land peasant families worked and take a share of their produce, or they might hold estates nearby and try to expand onto peasant ground, sometimes by force. Yet peasants did not only suffer from lordly power, they also tried to use it. Many entered into ties of dependence, seeking protection, backing in quarrels and help in hard times. The word protection appears often in the sources, and even today it carries the same double meaning that would have been understood then. Help mixed with threat. The tension between harsh lordship and peasant efforts to resist, avoid, or bend it to their own needs ran through the whole period. These broad patterns can be made a bit more precise by looking at 4 things: how peasants were ranked among themselves, how villages acted together, how peasant families were organized, and how peasants related to lords. Peasants did not form a single flat mass. The basic legal divide everywhere was between free and unfree people. Free men, and in many cases free women as well, had recognized public rights to own property, to sell or give it away, to appear in courts and take part in collective decisions. The unfree lacked such rights and were more directly under the power of an owner. Freeing an unfree person was a standard pious act, especially in property gifts made near death. Even so, it was often difficult. In some kingdoms, church leaders, for example, forbade such acts on church estates. In many regions, a freed person remained legally tied to a former master and needed that master's permission in important matters. Freedom, in such cases, did not wipe out dependence. Solidarity between the free and the unfree was hard to build. Court records sometimes show an unfree person arguing that he should be counted as free, only for his free neighbors to testify against him. Yet even this line was not absolute. Free and unfree tenants often owed similar dues and work to the same landlord. The unfree were certainly more vulnerable, but the differences were relative rather than total. For that reason, translating the Latin term for an unfree peasant simply as slave can be misleading. Within villages, there was a whole ladder of positions: substantial local owners with tenants of their own, smaller peasant owners, free tenants, unfree tenants. The border between owning and renting could matter almost as much as the border between free and unfree, although it was easier to cross. Many families both owned some plots and rented others. Villages differed in how far each rung of this ladder was present. Some had many independent owners, some almost none. Some had large groups of unfree tenants, others very few. Both the split between free and unfree and the ambitions of better-off families limited village unity. For richer locals, village business was rarely enough on its own to occupy their energies. They usually looked upward, towards powerful nobles and the wider public world. Free peasants, and in some places even unfree men, were expected to perform military service. Although no ruler could ever put all potential peasant soldiers into the field at once, a man with a horse, a weapon, and some skill could certainly find a place in an army, either under a private lord or under royal officers, or under both at different times. Over time, more members of village elites entered into formal ties of personal loyalty to higher lords, especially during the Carolingian period. In the 10th century, not only in former Frankish lands, but also in regions such as England and northern Spain, these lesser fighting men began to see themselves as a kind of small-scale local nobility. The line between them and non-military neighbors grew sharper. One result of this slow process was that ordinary peasants found it harder to approach kings and high nobles directly. The path into the upper ranks narrowed and became guarded by those already inside. Villages were not always strongly united bodies. In some areas, their internal divisions were deep. In others, even the basic sense of belonging to a single settlement was weak. Still, they existed as recognizable units. In early Frankish territories, there are traces of local courts at village or small district level, run by men known for their legal knowledge. These courts heard disputes according to remembered law. Similar arrangements likely existed in many regions, even if they are rarely recorded. Certain Frankish laws also show that a group of local free men had some say over who could settle among them. A newcomer could not simply arrive and claim a place in the community against the will of a substantial part of it. In many kingdoms and regions, village communities were made responsible as a whole for tasks such as catching thieves or tracking runaways, which presupposed some shared identity and collective action. In the Eastern Empire, a set of rules sometimes called a farmer's law shows villagers managing common pasture and woodland and standing surety for each other's taxes. None of this is astonishing in itself. Any society organized into village territories tends to develop some level of cooperation and self-regulation. What matters are the degree and the shape. Villages seem to have been strongest where people depended heavily on shared resources, such as pasture or forest. They were weaker where powerful outside landowners could use their weight to control local decisions. Most peasant households were simple in structure. The usual unit was a married couple and their children, rather than a broad extended group that also included grandparents, married siblings, and their families under one roof. This is very clear in some detailed estate descriptions and is supported by other scattered hints. Small and basic houses and relatively short life expectancy also reduced the chance that several adult generations would live together for long. Even so, wider kin relations mattered. Clashes between families could turn into feuds that stretched across cousins and more distant relatives. Within the household, there was a life cycle. Marriage and the years of raising children marked the peak of social importance for most men and women. After that, authority and public relevance often passed gradually to the next generation. In some regions, grave findings suggest that young women, in their late teens or early 20s, were buried with the richest ornaments, which fits a period soon after marriage. Men tended to reach their peak somewhat later, in their 20s or 30s, when they were most active in work, war, or public life. After that age, both men and women tend to appear with fewer goods in burials, as if the community no longer looked at them as central figures. Elderly people may have had respect within the family, but they did not hold obvious public privileges. Archaeology also highlights differences between the sexes that written texts barely mention. Across much of Western Europe between the 5th and 7th centuries, the graves of young women are rich in jewelry and dress fittings. Written sources, by contrast, say little about women below the noble level. In legal documents, the consent of wives to their husbands' actions appears sometimes, but not everywhere. Overall, women seem to have been confined more firmly than men to the private sphere. The expected path was clear. Marry, move into the husband's household, and remain under his control. In many regions, a daughter only inherited land if there were no sons. In such cases, she might receive a share of her parents' holdings, but even then she often needed the agreement of male relatives. Marriage gifts were mainly provided by husbands, and those men usually kept real control over such property until their deaths. In some areas, women at no point had full legal independence. Authority over them passed from father or brothers to husband, and then to sons. Elsewhere, a certain limited freedom was possible during widowhood, but even then it was narrow. Yet at the same time, women were important carriers of family image. The fine ornaments placed in their graves show how much effort families put into displaying their daughters and wives at key moments. In public life, women could be seen, but their role remained largely unspoken, and their power was meant to be invisible. Peasants had to coexist with aristocrats who might be landlords, protectors, rivals, or all three at once. From a peasant point of view, a powerful neighbor was always a potential threat. One early writer, speaking of a land-hungry noble, remarked that for such a man the mere fact of having someone living beside him felt like a misfortune. This remark could easily apply to many upper-class figures of the time. Even so, in the West, the period from roughly 500 to 800 may have been the time when aristocrats were least able to impose full control over the countryside. Old Roman elites survived the invasions, but were shaken. New Germanic elites needed time to form. In the Eastern Empire, the crisis of the 7th century had a similar effect. Rich families certainly survived, but their grip on their peasant neighbors was not always firm, except over their own close dependents. Only from the 8th century in Francia and Italy, the 9th in England, the 10th in some Spanish zones, and the Eastern Empire, and later still in Scandinavia, did noble control over local society become thick and hard to escape. Evidence for this process is uneven, but some patterns can be seen. In parts of Francia, and especially in Italy, 9th century court records show peasants appealing to public officials about the heavy hand of local nobles. In some Spanish regions, similar tensions surface closer to the year 1000. In England, archaeological signs of trade and market activity appear in one coastal region in the 8th century and spread widely only after the late 9th, suggesting that large-scale wealth and strong noble households were only just emerging. Traces of open peasant resistance are rare, but they exist. In Saxony, in the early 9th century, a major revolt broke out when new rulers tried to tighten control over communities that were still largely organized around free assemblies. In the northern mountains of the Iberian Peninsula, a rising is recorded in the late 8th century against growing lordship. In one high valley of central Italy, a group of villagers managed to resist the encroachment of a monastery for about 100 years, using every legal and informal tool they had. Another striking example comes from northern Francia, where peasant communities south of Paris formed a sworn association in the mid-9th century to resist Viking raiders. Some nobles saw this independent alliance as a dangerous model and moved quickly to crush it. These cases usually involve regions on the edge of larger systems, where peasant communities were cohesive and where noble power arrived suddenly. Overall, however, such episodes are exceptional. When the pressure of the powerful increased across most of Europe, peasant resistance did not stop the long-term change. By about 1000, nobles again had a level of dominance comparable to that of the late Roman age. Peasant worlds were less rich and less heavily armed than aristocratic ones, but they followed many of the same unwritten rules. Men in both layers were quick to anger and ready to answer insults with violence. Both men and women recognized gift-giving as a way to create lasting obligations. In every group, high status was tied to wealth, legal independence, and the ability to fight. There was also a social ladder that stretched without any clear break from the poorest free peasant at one end to the richest lord at the other. The steps on this ladder were tiny and hard to climb, but all free people, in law at least, belonged to the same broad political community and could, in theory, appeal to the same rulers and courts. This remained true for a long time in regions where public power stayed strong or aristocracies stayed relatively weak, such as in the Eastern Empire and in some parts of Northern Europe. In much of the Latin West, however, these links began to change around the year 1000. Groups of followers bound to lords had existed for centuries, and for that matter would exist long afterwards. They rested on the exchange of gifts, favors, and service. Lords promised protection, support in disputes, land, treasure, or regular feasting. Followers promised obedience, military help, and public backing. Early kings recognized this openly. Some decrees state that when a noble was away on royal business, the lawsuits of his friends, sworn dependents, and those under his influence should be delayed until he returned, underlining how closely tied he was to the fortunes of his group. In the age of the early Carolingians, the gestures around such dependence became more formal. Oaths of loyalty grew more detailed, and grants of land to dependents increasingly stressed that the land could be taken back in case of disloyalty. Terms for such conditional holdings started to appear, although the vocabulary remained fluid for a long time. In practice, strong men had always used force to reclaim property from faithless followers. The real novelty lay elsewhere. Under Carolingian rule, royal and comital armies were recruited almost entirely from these chains of followers, including the circles around kings and counts. Military service and identity came to be regarded less as a general duty of all free men and more as a mark of aristocratic standing. By the 9th century, fighting on horseback in a lord's retinue was increasingly viewed as a privilege that set a person apart. By the late 10th century, families of mounted warriors often saw themselves as a minor nobility, building their own local influence over peasants. In the early 11th century, an influential way of thinking about society took clearer shape in many regions: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The roots of this threefold scheme go back earlier, but its full development belongs to the generations after 1000, and it would shape thought for centuries. Throughout these centuries, the everyday dominance of nobles was a constant fact. They stayed close to kings when it was useful and turned against them when that seemed safer or more profitable. At the local level, they relied on their bands of followers to enforce their will, and the only real checks came from other nobles. This held true in the 9th century, when royal power was still strong, in the 10th, when great dukes and counts became the main reference points, and in the 11th, when many lords set up their own courts, and in some areas the older public assemblies either faded or turned into private tribunals controlled by hereditary counts. Some historians have seen the weakening of kings in the 10th century, or the later rise of independent counts, as great turning points. From the vantage point of village society, the picture looks more continuous. Local aristocratic dominance stretches across the whole period. Even so, this continuity should not be overstated. The tools of noble power had deep roots, but in the later 10th century, they began to combine in new ways. One key change concerned public assemblies of justice. In the Carolingian age, however biased in favor of nobles, such assemblies still represented a legal order that claimed to cover an entire kingdom. Lords might abuse power, but their more extreme acts could be condemned as contrary to public law. In parts of Western Europe during the 11th century, these assemblies disappeared or were transformed. Noble courts came to stand as the only recognized frame for law and judgment in large areas. The old line between public and private authority blurred or vanished. What had once been technically illegal, such as the violent seizure of rights by a lord, could now be wrapped in the language of rightful judgment within his jurisdiction. Where rulers could no longer act as a meaningful center, nobles stopped looking upward for sanction and built their whole position on their own local strength. Political structures became simpler in one sense. Instead of a layered system of center and locality, there were many separate pockets of power. As power settled at the local level, it could not remain vague. Lords who ruled over a district and expected their judgments and dues to be accepted needed to define what exactly they controlled. Over time, even confused and rough lordships began to generate their own customs. Old practices were reshaped into more precise rules. Legal expectations became clearer, territories more sharply outlined, and centers of domination more visible, often around fortified residences. Social lines also hardened, as fighting for a living became the normal mark of noble identity and the foundation for claiming rights over others. By the 12th century, local building blocks such as the seigneurial district, the village, and the parish had become distinct and well understood. These units provided the framework on which new, stronger central governments in later centuries would be rebuilt. Those later central powers drew less on the direct heritage of Roman state structures and more on the settled patterns that had formed in this later age of local lordship. Between 400 and 1,000, more than 9 out of 10 men lived and worked in the countryside, mostly on small farms where they tried to grow enough food to survive. Almost all of what they produced was eaten locally by the farmers themselves and by the few people around them who did not work the land, such as artisans, priests, and local lords. In this respect, early medieval conditions were not very different from those of the Roman Empire. The population was still largely rural, and agriculture remained the base of life. What changed was the social image. The Roman world is remembered as an urban civilization because towns collected and used a large share of agricultural surplus to support a wealthy ruling group. In the northwest of Europe before 1000, nothing similar existed. Settlements that some call towns lacked the dense economic and social role of Roman cities. Many historians therefore prefer to speak of proto-towns or proto-urbanization for this era. Around 1020, Bishop Gerard of Cambrai could still divide society simply into those who prayed, those who worked the land, and those who fought. About 100 years later, the writer Gelbert of Bruges could speak of the inhabitants of Bruges as our citizens and feel part of a distinct urban group. For historians, this raises a central question. Is the economy of the early Middle Ages nothing more than a rural economy? Or is there already some form of urban life before 1000? Since the 19th century, economic historians have tried to understand two turning points: the end of ancient civilization and the beginning of what they often call Europe. From the start, debates about the nature of the medieval economy have been linked to arguments over whether something like medieval capitalism existed. Most scholars long agreed that the end of antiquity went with the disappearance of slavery. That view has been challenged. Some historians argue that slavery, understood very strictly as a condition in which human beings are treated as legal property and economic assets, remained present in Western societies until the end of the 10th century, and that only later did a different system emerge after a period of social crisis sometimes described as a feudal revolution. Even if slavery survived in rich households into the Middle Ages, slaves seem to have formed only a small additional part of the workforce, much as in 6th century Byzantium. In the West, the rise of large estates from the 7th century onwards may have gone hand in hand with the settlement of former slaves on hereditary plots. When these people were drawn fully into the Christian community, their religious status changed, but social and legal discrimination did not disappear. This pattern is close to what Mark Bloch once called an early form of serfdom. Many historians still accept the idea that the early Middle Ages formed a kind of interlude marked by a general shift towards a more rural economy. The classic symbol of this is the large Carolingian estate, often taken as typical because it is relatively well documented. Such an estate gathered together granaries, stores of tools and equipment, craftsmen, and specialized workshops. It has often been seen as proof of a closed, self-sufficient system that had little need for trade or coin. In this view, the early medieval economy was largely household-based and non-commercial, with production organized around the needs of each estate and its lord. A different but related interpretation is associated with Henri Pirenne. For him, the Western Mediterranean world kept a strong sense of continuity with Roman civilization until late in the 6th century. He argued that the turning point came with the Arab conquest around the Mediterranean, which split the old empire into two separate zones. This break, in his reading, led to economic decline and political disorder in the West, and pushed the main center of gravity of Europe northwestwards. In that region, under the Carolingians, urban life and trade began to revive from the 11th century, laying the foundations for later medieval growth. Pirenne saw the region of modern Belgium as a miniature model of Western Europe. In his eyes, it was both a battleground for larger powers and a meeting point for Latin and Germanic cultures, and later a cradle for the ancient democracies of the Low Countries. These interpretations reflected his own background and values as a committed, patriotic, liberal scholar who believed strongly in progress driven by towns, trade, and commercial energy. Because his argument focused so heavily on the Mediterranean and on the Carolingian world, less attention was paid for a long time to what happened in the Western Mediterranean after the 7th century. The spectacular economic and urban growth of the 12th century also raises further questions. When did the processes that led to it begin? Some place the starting point in the 7th century, when new trading routes appeared in northwestern Europe. Others emphasize the 9th century and associate revival with Carolingian reforms. Many focus on the 11th century and the clear rebirth of towns. There is also debate over causes. Was growth mainly a response to renewed trade in the 10th and 11th centuries, or did it come from changes inside rural society itself, as peasants and lords increased agricultural output and drew more surplus off the land to support non-farming groups in castles and towns? Who drove this transformation? Long-distance merchants, kings, monks in charge of large estates, or the peasantry who opened and cultivated new land? Recent work stresses the constant interaction between town and countryside from a very early date and highlights the role of church institutions and political power in economic change. Capital could only be built up when surplus products were regularly drawn away from producers and gathered in centers of control. This meant moving value from villages to towns, and from peasants to nobles or urban elites. In this perspective, the countryside and its farming are not a backdrop, but the core of Europe's long-term development. Archaeology has broadened the picture by placing events known from texts, such as wars and political struggles, within a wider framework of how human societies reacted to their physical environment. From the 3rd century onward, the climate in many regions became gradually cooler and wetter. The low point seems to have come in the 6th century, when average temperatures dropped by roughly 1.5 degrees. The impact of these changes differed from place to place, but precise regional data are still scarce. Asia Minor appears to have had milder winters than the West, yet its landscape and climate remained harsh overall. For the West, much of our written evidence on weather, disasters, epidemics, and scarcity comes from Gregory of Tours, whose works contain vivid descriptions of flooding, storms, famine, and disease in 6th century Gaul. These accounts are extremely valuable, but reflect mainly one region. They cannot automatically be extended to all of Western Europe. Physical anthropology and studies of ancient diseases now provide another kind of evidence. A survey of thousands of skeletons from 6th and 7th century Germany suggests that most adults died in their late 30s and that health was generally poor, with common signs of childhood and nutritional diseases. Yet it is often impossible to connect such burial sites securely to known settlements or to social categories. In some excavated towns, conditions may have been better than one would expect. Work on late Roman and early medieval levels in places such as Marseilles and Maastricht suggests relatively mobile populations and, at least in some periods, acceptable living standards in urban environments where food shortages might have been anticipated. The material is still too thin to support broad general conclusions, however. In the Eastern Empire, movement of rural people was constant. Fields could be cultivated for a time, abandoned, and later brought back into use. Part of the flow out of the countryside was drawn by the attraction of towns. Another part was forced by heavy tax burdens on land. In some regions, large landowners took advantage of peasant weakness. They seized fields, animals, and even household dependents, and compelled poorer families to accept dependent status. One lawgiver compared this process to a foreign invasion. Elsewhere, land was given up because of war, repeated bad harvests, or epidemics. The Great Plague that began in the 540s came after a chain of natural disasters that included droughts in the eastern Mediterranean, earthquakes, locust swarms, and a period of poor sunlight that damaged crops. This outbreak of bubonic plague was probably as destructive as the Black Death that struck Western Europe 8 centuries later. As then, the sharp fall in population was followed by a period in which wages for laborers and artisans rose sharply. Legal texts from the time show that workers were able to demand much higher pay than before the plague, sometimes 2 or 3 times the normal rate, and that authorities tried to limit this. In Western Europe, it is tempting to explain contrasts between more prosperous and poorer regions by referring to how strongly and how long the plague affected each area. So far, the evidence does not really support such simple explanations. Local conditions seem to have mattered greatly. In some areas, soil, climate, and farming systems could recover from shocks more easily than in others. Before and during the early Middle Ages, many regions of Asia Minor supported continuous cultivation and livestock rearing. Later wars in the 10th century damaged some landscapes so badly that they could only be used for seasonal grazing, until new groups of settlers, including former nomads, moved in during the Turkish period. In fragile Mediterranean zones with thin red soils, large areas of semi-arid land were abandoned. Without regular cultivation and maintenance, soil erosion increased and scrub replaced earlier fields. Pollen studies from Italy show that forest and secondary vegetation expanded in temperate areas, suggesting a retreat of farming in some zones. Over time, however, people established new balances between tillage, woodland, and pasture, combining livestock grazing and woodland use with more intensive farming near settlements. Diets may have become more varied as a result. In northern Gaul and along the Rhine, woodland and heathland spread after the 3rd century, probably due to declining population and the breakdown of large-scale farming that had supplied towns and armies in late antiquity. Linguistic changes, such as the shifting frontier between Romance and Germanic speech, point to major movements of people. In regions that remained densely settled, however, occupation of the land shows strong continuity. Large Roman estates built to serve cities and garrisons were gradually abandoned. Settlements moved from high open plateau down into river valleys. The number of small family farms increased while total cultivated area shrank. Land near settlements stayed in use, but marginal and heavy soils returned to rough grazing or waste and would only be reclaimed centuries later during the great clearance movements of the 11th and 12th centuries. The typical landscape of Merovingian rural areas consisted of scattered clusters of houses, each surrounded by small fields and patches of uncultivated land. These low-density settlements match well with the small burial grounds revealed by archaeology. From the 7th century onwards, population growth pushed farmers and lords to expand cultivation and to create new sites of settlement. This was only the start of a long process that would peak later. After a phase of highly scattered farmsteads, some regions, such as parts of the Rhine Valley or Burgundy, saw a gradual regrouping of settlement in the 10th century, together with the abandonment of many hamlets. In zones dominated by livestock, clearings inside forest and scrub often remained only semi-permanent for centuries. The decline of the classical Roman villa was not sudden. New excavation methods that pay attention to traces of wooden buildings have shown that late Roman rural settlements often mixed stone structures with lighter timber constructions. From the 3rd century onward, many sites show adaptation and improvisation. Old houses were patched up, and new wooden buildings appeared. By the end of the 4th century, this mixed building style is found throughout the northwestern provinces, although southern Gaul and Italy kept solid Roman houses for longer. In some central French regions, very late mosaics laid in the 5th and early 6th centuries suggest a stronger survival of old elite culture and large villas. Timber building techniques were not simply imported by new peoples. They also revived older, local methods. Evidence of post-built structures returns in the archaeological record from the 3rd century, after having been rare for several hundred years. From the 6th century, a new type of rural settlement spread in northwestern Gaul. It consisted of groups of independent farmsteads linked by tracks. Each farm had a fenced or ditched enclosure with houses, raised granaries, storage pits, and small workshops. At the same time, a new term began to be used for such units. At first, it meant simply a dwelling, but by the 8th century, it often referred to a hereditary family farm held by tenants. From the 8th century, the climate began to warm and moved towards a high point around the 11th century, when average temperatures were noticeably higher than before. Human remains from both northern and southern regions suggest that malnutrition declined from the late 7th or early 8th century. Yet written records mention more famines between the 8th and the 11th centuries. A careful reading shows that many of these were short, hungry times between harvests rather than complete collapses of food supply. Major, widespread famines seem to have become less common in the 10th century, before rising again in the 11th. Some historians see these crises as the price of population growth and agricultural expansion.